Welcome back to RGR Craft. I'm Ryan, and this is me going rogue on the craft beer industry, how to homebrew, do some reviews as well as a bunch of other instructional stuff, and trying to get my schedule down. Trying to lean towards, Homebrew Wednesday, which is pretty common for most folks. Been a little challenged with that because of the other podcasts and all the production around here, but want to give you a heads up. Today we're going to talk about equipment and how to get into homebrewing and some of the big keys. There's going to be a series of these going on. This will be the first. But before I get into all that, I want to let you guys know that I have a great interview coming for you next time with Scott Ungerman, the brewmaster at Anchor Brewing in San Francisco, a classic. When we're going to talk about Anchor Steam, you'll see that on the next episode. Great conversation. I think you guys are going to really see what the difference has become in craft beer today from, say, 10, 15 years ago. Big evolution, and that's why so many people are getting into it, to tell you the truth. So, that said, today we're going to cover the first step in any brew system is getting hot water. And we can talk about treatment of that water later for any number of topics. But getting the water hot so that you can then do the first step in removing sugar from grain requires your brew kettle. There are some all-in-one systems that'll do everything in one vessel. We can cover those later. They are getting more and more popular. But for today, we're going to talk about a standard 3-vessel system, which is not actually what I use. I use a 2-vessel system, and again, I'll go over that once we get through the basics. The kettle itself can be an old keg. It can be a stainless steel bucket. I've even seen people use just regular old pots on their stove at home. I don't recommend that, but I've seen it done. So the key is, I'm going to start from where I would go, which is a nice 8-gallon pot, stainless steel, because then you can easily clean it afterwards. And the stainless steel doesn't hold any odors or flavors, so you don't get carryover from batch to batch, and that's really important. So the first step is to get something with handles. A lot of folks end up trying to reuse something else from another purpose. As long as it has handles so that you can move it around with gloves on and be safe with hot liquid, that's important, especially if you're starting from scratch and you're going to brew inside on a stove, which is a little bit problematic. You got to be very careful with moving hot liquids. So let it have handles. Some of the better ones have silicone coated handles. That makes life a lot easier as well. But you want to get it so that you have a couple of things. And the very basic is that you have a spigot at the bottom near the water level, as you can try to get as much out of that kettle as possible. You're going to use it in this first step to heat the water. And you want to get it up to what they call strike temperature. And that's going to be dependent on where you're starting to mash. And there are calculations you can use. Beersmith's a popular one, Brewer's Friend, there's a number of them out there. I'll link to some of them down below for you guys that are trying to get started in brewing. That said, they'll calculate the temperature differential for you. The material will matter, whether it's stainless steel or not, or whether it's some other type of vessel. That will have a little bit of change on the temperature value as well. But you want to get it up to, say, I strike at 138 most times to get into my lower rests. And that takes getting that water volume, and depending on how big a batch you're talking about, getting a significant water volume up to that temperature. Now, there are a number of ways you can do that. Like I said, you can use gas on a stove. I use a propane burner that is standalone. You've seen them mostly like a turkey fryer. And I'll be laying images over the top of this the whole way so you can get an idea of what it looks like. And then you want to get that flame so that it's not overcompensating, being inefficient. You shouldn't see a stack of the flame way off. The flame should be pretty tight to the nozzles where it's coming out so that you get a nice, efficient burn. Sometimes that takes a little bit longer. You want to get a pot, kettle with a lid. So if you're using an old keg that's been circled out at the top, make sure you get a lid for it. There are a lot that you can fit some Pyrex cooking lids on top of them. They'll fit just fine. So those are available. And that will help you heat your water quicker, more efficiently without losing heat out the top. And that's really important. And as you get to that temperature, you have to have a way, especially if you're getting into the 5 and 10 gallon batch size, you have to have an efficient way to move that volume of water. That's where it gets a little bit tricky. Now, again, you have to be cautious with hot liquid. You don't want to hurt yourself or anybody else who might be in the area with you. There are a couple of ways. There's a tiered system where people do put burners, induction plates, or anything else that they're using to heat it. I've even people used on small volume batches sous vide sticks that you use in cooking with a water bath. You want to put those up so that you can then gravity feed out the bottom of that spigot into your mash tun. And that spigot, there are a couple of different kinds, and there's a couple of things that can go along with it. You want to be able to filter a little bit. We'll talk about this more in the mash tuns, but you should have a ball valve. At the very basic, a ball valve at the bottom of the kettle, hopefully with a little racking arm that'll come nearly down to the very bottom, not touching so you can let volume through, but can get a lot of volume off the bottom of the kettle so that you can then drain. And gravity draining's fine if that's what you want to do. I don't like putting hot liquid or burners up very much, so what I use is a pump. And a pump is another piece of equipment. We'll go over those in some brands here in the next couple of videos. But I use a pump to then take it out the bottom of the kettle and pump it all the way up to the top of the mash tun. And that does the job. Now, when you're doing that transfer, you do have to take into account a couple of things. The length of the run, the tubing, the thickness of the tubing in particular, as well as how much heat you lose in your pump. I use a Riptide pump from Blickman, and that is a large metallic head that absorbs a little bit more heat than some other types of pumps. So that is part of the calculation as well. And as you pump the water uphill to the mash tun, there's a couple of things to take into consideration along that run and that drop off in temperature. Do you want to expose it to the air by filling in from the top, or do you want to pump up from the bottom and fill gradually and wet the grains that way? We'll talk about all those when it comes to the mash tun episode, which should be next. And that's really the point of it. After you get done with the mash, you're going to then feed back into the kettle, and that's where you're going to do your boil. There are a number of ways to do that as well, with a pump or with gravity. Gravity, a three-tiered system of stepping down the gravity, makes liquid move pretty easily, and that's definitely a great way for beginners to get started. And then as the wort comes back in, you've gotten it through the mash and you've done all those steps that we'll cover. You get it back in the kettle, and that's when you turn the heat back up. Again, I like to use a propane burner for that heat element. And you need to get that volume of sugary wort back up to temperature and get it to a boil. Now, where I live up at altitude, it's not that hard because my water boils at about 195 rather than at sea level. So it makes things a little bit different for wherever you are located in the country. You'll get that up to a rolling boil. And then there'll be conversations we'll have later about just how much of a vigorous boil you want. But that's what the boil kettle's for. It's a very critical piece of equipment at both the beginning and the end stages of making your beer. It does have to be substantial enough to take boiling conditions for over an hour, sometimes longer than 90 minutes, depending on what you're doing. It needs to be robust and easily cleanable. So again, my suggestion would be stainless steel. There are a number of ways to go, and there are places where you can find them, whether a local homebrew shop or places online that I can point you to in the show notes. So that's step number one. That's piece of equipment number one. Let me know what you guys think. What's your opinion on what kettle or what kind of kettle to do? Anything in particular that you like to add on to it? Leave them in the notes below, or if you have any specific questions, put those in the comments as well. I appreciate all your time. Thanks for checking this one out. Don't miss the next episode with Scott Ungerman from Anchor Brewing. That's going to be a great show, and I'll talk to you then.